days later.
No. A year later.
A year later. Oh, this is all 2002.
This is 2002.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very important for people to understand. A lot of people think that the peace offering must have arrived too late for action. That's not true. It was done 2 years over the previous 2 years, and it really the talks started 2 years before the invasion, and it could have been wrapped up and the talks finished with great success by December of 2001, at the end of the first year of the Bush administration. So right after 9/11, between September and December, there was intense conversation, and we had to make sure that it did not collapse after 9/11. I had to pull it back together and make sure that it was going to stay strong and keep it on the table so that that 9/11 wouldn't wreck it, because 9/11 was supposed to be a smashing ball. It was supposed to trash the whole thing, or it could have, and I was not going to let that happen. So in December of 2001, after 9/11, the Iraqis reaffirmed their commitment and even took it even farther. They took it as far as we possibly could to absolutely lock in every single thing that we could possibly think of. That's when the Iraqis offered to hand over financial documents on Al-Qaeda. They offered everything the United States was demanding, even in minutia.
Yeah.
Like John McCain, to show you how funny this is, it's not funny, it's awful funny. John McCain demanded that Iraq had to allow the FBI to interview the Iraqi diplomat in Prague who allegedly met Mohammed Atta. And the same day, in November of 2001, that John McCain made this demand, the Iraqis immediately agreed within hours. And I was visiting the Iraqi embassy, and I said, John McCain just made this demand. They said, yes, we know, we agree, send the FBI. Within hours, John McCain had his wish. And I went back to my cousin Andrew Card and Scooter Libby, who was the chief of staff for Dick Cheney, and I made sure that both of these gentlemen had the final debriefing paper, which was dated December 2nd, 2001, and in that debriefing paper I said that they could have their Mohammed Atta interview. And so later on, when Dick Cheney comes back and repeats and regurgitates this, they already knew that they could have what they wanted. They regurgitated the demand, but they had already been answered in the affirmative. And the Iraqis were eager, because this was their strongest suit, was anti-terrorism.
Sure. Okay. So then I don't think we're quite done with the timeline now that I think about it, because so we have this additional meeting with the Security Council.
Yeah, but this was a year earlier.
I understand that. And then at some point in time, the Security Council changed their mind. We all remember Colin Powell, or no?
No.
Okay.
No.
So let's talk about what happened after the next meeting that was...
Okay, well, what happened was the Security Council, the United Nations showed how weak it is, really, as a decisive body. They were on you had Kofi Annan, that dreadful Kofi Annan, a man who I think he won the Nobel Peace Prize. Another man who should never in his lifetime have been allowed to have the Nobel Peace Prize. I think the UN won it for itself. They campaigned for it.
Okay.
Real terrible people. But they were trying to elevate the idea of global diplomacy, which is very important. But they just have failed in their task, failed in their mission. But it's a good mission, it's just they're not living up to the standard. So, okay. Okay, you're looking at it. Okay. So the weapons inspections started, gosh, by October. When did they start? They started in October. Sometime. The Iraqis, throughout the year 2002, the Iraqi government kept saying, start the weapons inspections, go ahead, come on in. And the United Nations began to respond to the Bush administration and began to kind of drag its feet and slow down preparations for the inspections. So the Iraqis were always ready for the weapons inspections to start throughout 2002, and the United Nations was kind of slow getting together, getting its members together and getting everybody out there. But once they started, what happened was Iraq was highly cooperative, and Iraq allowed people to inspect their suitcases, they inspect their workers' briefcases, to go in and out of every building. It was going so smoothly. And I believe this started by about October. Okay. So you have the vote for war. At the same time, you have the weapons inspections starting. The weapons inspections are going very smoothly, no problems. That was in large part because of what I had done with Iraqi diplomats in January and February of 2002, 9 months before the inspection started. After the Iraqis had agreed to everything the United States wanted, I did one last thing. I had private meetings with Iraqi diplomats outside the embassy at a hotel in New York, going through every single crisis situation that had caused problems in the past, and talking with the Iraqi diplomats over how it would be done differently this time. So we looked at previous behavior that had caused the confrontation, and we looked at specific examples of what needed to change at the Iraqi level so that we could make sure this would succeed. Because the CIA was like, well, you know, the Iraqis can agree today, but what's going to happen when we get in there? What are they really going to do when we get on the ground? So this was like an extra burden that the Iraqis had to show that they recognized the previous things hadn't worked. We had to find a new way to do it. And so by the time some of our conversations were probably pretty silly. At one point, I have a very dark sense of humor. And the Iraqis, what was tragic, so tragic, the Iraqis kept saying, but Susan, what's going to happen when you don't find anything? There isn't anything to have, and you're going to come in and there's not going to be any weapons. And what are they going to do when they realize that there's nothing there? And so I knew that there would never be weapons of mass destruction because the Iraqis were so worried about what was going to be the reaction. And at one point I did crack a joke to the diplomats, which is a pretty sick joke. But I said that they should buy weapons from Iran, which was their mortal enemy, and they should ship them through Syria, which was kind of an enemy at that stage, and that they should bring them in and hold a press conference at the border telling the United Nations, here are your weapons of mass destruction. Now we are turning them over to you. We have purchased them just for you. Here they are. Now you can take them away. Give up now we're ready to go on and do business. Because we were all concerned of what was going to happen when the United States came up empty-handed. And most of the conversations with Iraqi diplomats focused on how would the United States save face? How would Britain get out of their corner? Because they had told the whole world this great propaganda lie about these weapons of mass destruction. And what could be done to help the United States overcome its embarrassment? Okay? What could be done to help the United States overcome its embarrassment? And that said everything to me. I knew that the tone of the conversation, the concerns of the Iraqis were not, are you really going to talk to our scientists? They didn't care if they talked to scientists. That was a propaganda invention, disinformation at the time that the Bush administration put out, that the Iraqis were terrified that we would interview their scientists outside the control of the government, and the scientists would. Now, what the scientists were afraid was the White House the Bush administration would try to put words in their mouths. So some of the Iraqi scientists wanted to tape the conversations for their own protection, so that if the government tried to say later, if the UN tried to say later on, you told us there might be, they'd say, here's the tape. And so some of that was of issue, but they didn't say that they had to give the tape to the government, and they didn't even say that it had to be that they had to hold on to the tape. They were willing to let the United Nations hold on to the tapes and the record, just like I'm making a record here. Yeah. But nobody can come back and say, well, Susan said this or that. Oh. They wanted a record of it, yeah. And so that was a very reasonable thing. But I think that we agreed that they would that it would be recorded, and the United Nations would hold on to the tapes.
Okay. So I think this does give us, at least on the congressional side and the United Nations side, a really pretty good timeline of what happened. And I think we'll take a little break here. Okay. And then we'll come back and we'll talk about some of the other things.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to explain how Iraq and 9/11 intersect. And it's very important to know that all of these debriefings were being given to my cousin, Chief of Staff, White House Chief of Staff, Andrew Card. And there were 11 debriefings on the Iraqi Peace Initiative in all, before and after 9/11, building up to the invasion. At the same time, something else was happening with 9/11. And I realize that a lot of people there's a split interest in this audience, but you can't understand Iraq unless you understand what happened with 9/11 as a false flag to push us into this war. And you need to understand this history because I'm very convinced they will attempt another false flag to drag us into war with Iran. And so you need to see how these two are juxtaposed. In April of 2001, I received a command from my CIA handler, Richard Fuse, that he had a message that he wanted to transmit to Iraqi diplomats at the United Nations, and he wanted me to come over to his office right away, and I would, so that I could gather the information and take it up. And he told me when I arrived that the United States was seeking any fragment of intelligence on airplane hijackings and a strike on the World Trade Center, specifically. And that if Iraq discovered this information and failed to pass it back to the White House through my back channel, then if it was discovered they had concealed the information, the United States would declare war on Iraq. It would bomb them back to the Stone Age. At that point, they said they would bomb them harder than they'd ever been bombed before. And this was very difficult to communicate to the Iraqis because they'd already been viciously attacked for so many years. So I said, sure, I'll deliver that message. I went up to Iraq, to the embassy at the United Nations, and I spoke with diplomats. I had a very cordial conversation. At this stage, throughout those previous years, Iraq had been one of our best sources of terrorism intelligence. They had always been very cooperative. Saddam Hussein was convinced that jihadis would eventually try to overturn his secular Arab government in favor of an Islamic regime and try to take advantage of the dire poverty of the people and the lack of central authority over the country. So, he really did try to cooperate. He was very cooperative on terrorism. So when I went up to see the diplomats said, well, sure, we'll be happy to pass this message to Baghdad. I was very congenial. They were congenial, and I left. I went back to Washington. My CIA handler said, come see me. I want a debriefing. What did Iraq say when you threatened them? I said, well, I didn't need to threaten them. There was no reason. They've promised to send the message back to Baghdad through diplomatic channels. He said, wait a minute. I did not tell you to be nice to these people. I told you to tell those blankety-blanketies that they'd better blankety-blankety do this. And he used very, very strong language to forcefully communicate his position. And he said that he demanded that I go back to New York and I tell the diplomats, quote, this threat originates at the highest levels of government, above the CIA director and above the Secretary of State. Now this is important because as a back channel, I had always been taught not to modify a message. This is not my vocabulary that I interjected. This was their vocabulary, and they were quite committed to communicating it a certain way. I'd already gotten in trouble for being kind of soft pedaling the threat because I knew they would cooperate. So I went back to New York and I delivered the message exactly as I was told. And the Iraqis were very chagrined. Of course, we all knew what this meant. The only three people above the CIA director and the Secretary of State are President George Bush, Vice President Dick Cheney, and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. And that meant that those people already knew about the 9/11 threat. They already knew exactly what the modus operandi of this attack would be. They had a precise target. They knew the methodology. I also am on record, a witness in my case testified that I told him in the spring of 2001 that the attack would occur in late summer early fall. So according to this independent witness, we were very precise even to the timing of the attack from the get-go. We knew that it would happen in late August or early September. And I told civilians this information, and they testified to that under oath in a court of law 1,000 feet from ground zero where the World Trade Center once stood. But the point is that I went back to Iraq, to the Iraqis, and they threw up their hands. They said, "Oh my goodness, you know, They were chagrined. They were very upset. They said to me, this was now May of 2001. They reminded me that the ambassador to Iraq, former ambassador to Iraq, who was now the deputy foreign minister, Dr. Saeed Hassan, had already invited the FBI to send a terrorism task force into Iraq for legitimate law enforcement work, not CIA intelligence gathering. It had to be legitimate law enforcement, with authorization to conduct terrorism investigations, interview witnesses, and make arrests, if we thought that there was a legitimate conspiracy. And so the diplomats said, well, you know, we already have this permission from the deputy foreign minister of Iraq. And if you think there's a terrorism conspiracy, then send in the FBI right now. Go ahead and do it. Because all of us were aware of the peace option that I've just described to you. And so all of us we were on the fast track to a very successful comprehensive peace. And the Iraqis were eager to get the weapons inspection started. They didn't want anything to derail this plan. They wanted to restore their relations with the United States as fast as possible. And they were eager to oblige the United States. They proved it again and again and again. So I went back to Washington and communicated this message to Richard Fuess. Throughout the summer of 2001, we had meetings every week, and practically every single meeting we talked about this threat. And we were very agitated about it. We were very disturbed about it. It was not a light. It was not light conversation. It was not a passing concern. This was a priority, and we were very concerned that how would we have the peace option was going to achieve everything. And Richard kept saying, you know, well, the Iraqis need to understand they're going to get everything. Everything is going the right way towards ending the sanctions. They have to give the United States what we want, and then they can have their sanctions lifted. And of course, we would get all these great things for ourselves: cooperation with terrorism, contracts for American corporations, oil. Let's get on with business. Who needed a terrorist attack? That would be a disaster. It would be a debacle to have that happen, a catastrophe, and we could avoid it. And so, he pressed me very hard to push the Iraqis for anything we could get, because he knew that there was already talk in Washington circles. The administration was already prepping this intelligence community, and frankly, to the credit of the intelligence community, I have now learned, and it has been reported, the intelligence community was pushing back, and it wasn't just me. The intelligence community kept telling Bush, no, Saddam Hussein has a deep hatred of these Islamic jihadis. Iraq does not possess any intelligence on this, and there's no history of relations with terrorist groups, because Saddam is so afraid of them, because he's afraid they're going to destabilize his secular society and install an Islamic radical government, and he taking advantage of the poverty of the people under sanctions. So they were like, no, this is wrong, and you're going to lose everything we could get. So this happens throughout the summer. I also was on the phone. We'd get on the phone, and some of the conversations may seem flip to you. I would get on the phone and say, hey, NSA. I'd be talking to him or Paul Hoven and say, hey, NSA, you've been tapping our phones for years waiting for this moment. There's a terrorism, we expect a terrorism attack. We expect airplane hijackings to occur and strike the World Trade Center, and pick up the phone. Hey, NSA, pick up the phone, pick up the phone. You need to start coordinating intelligence gathering on this attack. And Paul Hoven would say very sternly, this is not a hoax.
We are very concerned about this. This is a real threat. And we are having this conversation on the phone right now because we are counting on you to pick this up because you've tapped Susan's phones and our phones are tapped, and we are expecting you to take action and take note. And this is not a hoax. Susan, do not make a joke of this, because I have a very dark sense of humor, and sometimes it's a little bit off-putting to people. But I deal with people who are monsters all the time. I deal with tragedies all the time. And so I do, and it's just, sometimes it's just too awful to even imagine what's happening, and I have to keep my balance, and I have to keep fighting even when it is so ugly and so hard, and even when I'm taking a beating, I can't stop, because if I stop, then you're dumb, then you're down too. Everything goes down if I stop. So I have to keep going even if I don't feel like it today. So that's also true. But throughout the summer of 2001, we talked about this all the time. There was a lot of buzz in the the intelligence community. The Iraqis responded that all of the chatter, there was also international chatter, okay? But the Iraqis told me something that was very important. They said that all of the chatter originated with us, with the West, with Washington. And so they might have been hearing things in the international community as well. Egypt was talking about it, Jordan was talking, Germany was talking. We all know Israel knew about it. But everybody it was just like a live wire of conversation, that we all knew this was coming. Everybody knew it was coming. And we were all being prepped for it. Okay, and that means that the government was prepping us to expect it to happen a certain way. They had already started writing the official story of 9/11. That does not mean the official story is true. That's very important. People don't understand that. That was the story that they were creating. This is my story and I'm sticking to it. And it was already being written, okay? Such that on August 2nd, which was, I can tell you the exact day, it was Robert Mueller's Senate nomination hearing. And on a Thursday, and I was talking to Richard Fuse on the phone, and I told him, I said, my God, there's never been a terrorism investigation this guy didn't throw. You know he's going to throw this next attack too. And he said, and Richard said, well, he said, I know he threw the Lockerbie attack, the Lockerbie negotiation. What other ones do you think? And I said, well, Oklahoma City too, trying to say that Timothy McVeigh did this alone and there was no Islamic connection, because we knew there was. We know that Terry Nichols traveled overseas and had meetings in the Philippines with Ramzi Youssef. They visited the same Islamic radical university with a lot of Abu Sayyaf connections. And we know that they were getting financing and technical advice from bomb maker Ramzi Youssef. So, you know, there were sources who saw them together. So I was like, you know, Robert Mueller has a history of this, and I think he's the wrong guy for the job, because we know what is going to happen when this attack goes down. We were already talking about the cover-up of 9/11 6 weeks before 9/11 actually happens, okay? And we were angry that he was the perfect, ideal candidate to cover it up, because he'd do whatever the politicians told him to do. And so I was really mad. Well, Richard said, well, what, God, Susan, what if there is no FBI director when this happens? What if the attack occurs and, you know, there's no leadership to guide the FBI investigation from the opening hours? And I said, oh my God, do you think it's that soon? He said, oh yeah, the attack is imminent. We expect the attack any day. We're expecting mass casualties. We always expected the towers to crash. We never expected the towers to stay standing. And we always were prepped from, like I said, the intelligence prepping was, there would be both airplane hijackings and some sort of nuclear, miniature thermonuclear device explosive tied to the building somehow. And I remember talking with Paul Hoven and saying, well, where are they going to get the bombs from? And Paul saying to me, oh, that's easy. there's so many munitions dumps up and down the military munitions spots, arsenals up and down the East Coast. They can take some ID and drive into one of those military sites and drive off in a truck with whatever they need, whatever type of explosives they want. They can get very easily and take it up to the World Trade Center and put it in there. And I was like, oh God, we ought to warn them to post more guards. That was my reaction. Let's post more guards and stop them from stealing it. And Paul was like, oh, well, the military is very lax. We don't have any control over that. It wasn't Paul's fault. He was telling the truth. It was not very well guarded before 9/11. People don't know that. And so we always expected this. This was a kind of conversation happened in July of 2001. And so by August, when we have the Robert Mueller's nomination hearing, we are already convinced, we're deeply convinced this is coming. It's coming fast, it's coming soon, and it's going to be catastrophic. So I told Richard on August 2nd that I would go right back to New York and talk to my Iraqi diplomats and see if they'd gotten anything at all from Baghdad. Richard's response was, first, oh my God, it's too dangerous. He said, don't go back up there. No. It's too difficult, it's too dangerous. I want you to stay out of New York until after the attack is over.
And the date of this was?
This was August 2nd.
Okay.
And I said to him, well, I've got to check with the Iraqis. I've been bugging them all summer. I've been hitting them up for this, and we've got to make sure that they don't have anything. I said, I will go up the day after tomorrow. That was August 4th, Saturday, August 4th. And I will come to your office first thing Monday morning, August 6th. Remember the day of the presidential briefing memo. That's August 6th, same day. And I will tell you whatever the Iraqis have said. Now, I want to take a little bit of a detour, because right at this point, simultaneously, when I was in Japan on a book tour, I had already written the first edition of Extreme Prejudice. So this information arrived too late to put in the book. While I was in Japan giving this speech talking about what we did in August of 2001, when I came home, I found a 10-year-old newsprint copy of the Wall Street Journal tucked under a rose quartz crystal by the computer on my desk. And there's no way it had been there for very long, because by this time I'd been in prison, I'd been locked up, my stuff had been packed away, and there's no way. It was very old, it's the original newsprint. And it was taken from the office where this conversation occurred on August 2nd. It was not, the conversation was not at my house. It was at a consulting job I had. And somebody had gone in that weekend. It was dated July 30th, 2001, 6 weeks before 9/11, but in time for this presidential briefing memo, And so somebody had broken into the office over the weekend and had grabbed a newspaper off the desk, and that's a proof, what we call a proof of life, a status report. It's very common in the intelligence community. You don't have to look too hard. It's got the date on it, it's got the address, it's got the name of the contact information of who I was working with. So it's got a good little snapshot. Just the title of it alone will tell you a lot. Just the address on the mailing envelope will tell you a lot. So that's what they typically do. And somebody had, while I was in Japan talking about this for the very first time, describing this meeting, somebody in the spook world wanted me to know